On the morning of January 3rd, 2026, as American fighter jets screamed over Caracas and explosions rocked the Venezuelan capital, one target stood out as particularly symbolic among the military installations, government buildings, and regime strongholds that were being struck. It wasn't a weapons depot or a command center. It was a mausoleum, a grand marble tomb housing the embalmed body of Hugo Chávez, the man who had died 13 years earlier, but whose ghost had ruled Venezuela ever since. When the bombs fell on that sacred shrine to the Bolivarian Revolution, destroying the carefully preserved corpse and reducing the monument to rubble, something broke in the Venezuelan national psyche. For millions of exiles watching from Miami, Bogota, and Madrid, for the refugees who had walked thousands of miles to escape the nightmare Venezuela had become, the destruction of Chávez's tomb was more than military strategy. It was exorcism. To understand why America targeted a dead man's grave, why Venezuelans celebrated its destruction, and why this moment mattered so profoundly, we must journey back decades to understand who Hugo Chávez really was, what he did to Venezuela, and how his legacy of authoritarianism, personality cult, and revolutionary fervor created the monster that was Nicolas Maduro. Hugo Rafael Chávez Frías was born on July 28, 1954, in a small town called Sabaneta in the rural state of Barinas, Venezuela. His parents were school teachers, which meant the family was neither rich nor desperately poor. They were what you might call lower middle class in a country where oil wealth had created both spectacular luxury and grinding poverty. Young Hugo was not a particularly exceptional student, but he was athletic, charismatic, and ambitious. He joined the Venezuelan Military Academy not out of any great love for military discipline, but because it offered free education and a path to social mobility for a kid from the provinces. What nobody could have predicted was that this young cadet would one day overthrow Venezuela's democratic system and replace it with a revolutionary dictatorship that would inspire imitators across Latin America and leave millions dead, imprisoned, or exiled. Chávez's formative years in the military during the 1970s and 1980s coincided with a period of profound disillusionment in Venezuela. The country sat on top of the world's largest proven oil reserves, yet corruption was rampant, poverty was widespread, and the two-party democratic system seemed to serve only the elites. The Pontefijo Pact, the power-sharing agreement that had governed Venezuela since 1958, kept the same faces rotating through power while ordinary people struggled. Chávez, stationed in rural areas where he saw poverty firsthand, began to develop a radical political philosophy. He secretly founded an organization called the Revolutionary Bolivarian Movement, 200, named after Simón Bolívar, the 19th century revolutionary who had liberated much of South America from Spanish colonial rule. Chávez worshipped Bolívar with an intensity that bordered on religious fervor, carrying a miniature portrait of him everywhere and claiming to receive visions and instructions for Bolívar's spirit. This wasn't just political theater. Chávez genuinely believed he was the chosen heir to Bolívar's legacy, destined to complete the liberation of Latin America from foreign domination. On February 4th, 1992, Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chávez led a military coup attempt against the democratically elected government of President Carlos Andrés Pérez. The coup failed spectacularly. Chávez's tanks rolled into Caracas. There was fighting around the presidential palace, and when the smoke cleared, between 143 and several hundred people lay dead, the exact number still disputed to this day. Chávez was captured and imprisoned. But here's where the story takes a turn that would define everything that followed. President Pérez made a catastrophic decision. He allowed Chávez to appear on national television to call for his fellow coup plotters to surrender. In that brief television appearance, Chávez, still in his red paratrooper's beret, looked directly into the camera and said the words that would launch his political career, por ahora, which means for now. He accepted responsibility for the failed coup for now, implying that the fight would continue, that this was merely a setback in a longer revolutionary struggle. Those two words electrified millions of poor Venezuelans who saw in this handsome, charismatic military officer someone who had actually tried to change a system they hated. Overnight, Chávez went from failed coup leader to folk hero. Chávez spent 2 years in prison, where he read voraciously Marx, Lenin, Mao, Che Guevara, and especially Simón Bolívar. He emerged in 1994 after President Rafael Caldera pardoned him, and he immediately began organizing politically. What many people don't know is that Chávez seriously considered launching another armed coup in the mid-1990s. He traveled to Cuba and met with Fidel Castro, who gave him crucial advice that changed history. Castro told him, "Don't try another coup. You'll just end up dead or back in prison. Use democracy to destroy democracy from within. Run for office, win legitimately, then change the system once you have power." It was Machiavellian brilliance, and Chávez took it to heart. In 1998, running on a platform of revolutionary change, anti-corruption, and wealth redistribution, Hugo Chávez won the Venezuelan presidency in a landslide. For millions of poor Venezuelans who had been ignored by the political establishment for decades, his victory felt like liberation. Here was a man who spoke their language, who promised to take the oil wealth controlled by elites and use it to build schools, hospitals, and subsidize housing for the masses. His inauguration speech lasted hours and referenced Bolívar over 30 times. Almost immediately, he began to systematically dismantle Venezuelan democracy while claiming to perfect it. His first major move was to call for a constitutional assembly to rewrite Venezuela's constitution. The new constitution, approved in 1999, was a masterpiece of democratic-sounding language that actually concentrated enormous power in the presidency. It extended presidential terms, allowed immediate re-election, weakened the legislature, and created mechanisms through which the president could rule by decree. Chávez called it the Bolivarian Constitution and sold it as people power. In reality, it was the blueprint for dictatorship. One provision that often gets overlooked, but was crucial. The new constitution made it much easier to call referendums on any issue, which sounds democratic until you realize that Chávez controlled the media, had unlimited state resources to campaign, and could essentially legislate by popular vote, bypassing all checks and balances. The early years of the Chávez presidency saw genuine improvements for many poor Venezuelans. Using soaring oil revenues, he launched programs called missions. Misión Barrio Adentro brought Cuban doctors to poor neighborhoods. Misión Robinson taught literacy. Misión Vivienda built housing. For people who had never seen a doctor or owned a home, Chávez was a miracle worker. But there was a price. The programs were deliberately designed to bypass existing institutions and create direct dependency on Chávez personally. You didn't go to a government hospital funded by the health ministry. You went to a Chávez clinic staffed by Cuban doctors who work for Chávez. The message was clear. Your well-being depended on Chávez remaining in power. In 2002, Venezuela's opposition, backed by business leaders, parts of the military, and implicitly by the United States, attempted to overthrow Chávez in a coup. For about 48 hours, it looked like they had succeeded. Chávez was arrested and a business leader named Pedro Carmona declared himself president. But the coup plotters made catastrophic mistakes. They dissolved the National Assembly, the Supreme Court, and all democratic institutions, revealing their true authoritarian intentions. Mass protests erupted, loyal military units refused to recognize the new government, and within 2 days Chávez was back in power. The failed coup was the best thing that ever happened to him politically. He could now claim to be a martyr, a democratic president defended by the people against oligarchs and American imperialism. For the rest of his presidency, any criticism of Chávez could be painted as support for coup plotters and traitors. This is where Chávez's human rights abuses and crimes really accelerated, though they are often overlooked because his international image as a champion of the poor overshadowed the reality. After 2002, Chávez systematically destroyed judicial independence. He packed the Supreme Court with loyalists through a law that increased the number of justices and allowed him to appoint them. From that point on, any legal challenge to his actions was dead on arrival. Opposition politicians began to be arrested on trumped-up charges. Media outlets that criticized him were shut down, through regulatory harassment or outright force. In 2007, he refused to renew the broadcast license of RCTV, the country's oldest and most watched television station, because it had been critical of him during the coup. Millions of Venezuelans lost access to independent news overnight. Human Rights Watch released a devastating 230-page report in 2008 documenting Chávez's systematic violations of human rights, including political discrimination, attacks on judicial independence, and intimidation of civil society. Chávez's response was telling. He had the director and deputy director of Human Rights Watch forcibly detained and expelled from Venezuela, with his foreign minister, a man named Nicolas Maduro, announcing that any foreigner who comes to criticize our country will be immediately expelled. That foreign minister, of course, was the same man who would succeed Chávez and take his authoritarian playbook to even more brutal extremes. What many people outside Venezuela don't realize is that Chávez's economic policies, even at their peak, were catastrophic. He nationalized over 1,000 private companies, oil operations, banks, cement plants, steel mills, supermarkets, agricultural land. In almost every case, these enterprises collapsed after nationalization due to incompetence, corruption, and lack of investment. Productivity plummeted. Venezuela, which should have been an agricultural powerhouse, became dependent on imported food. But as long as oil prices stayed high, Chávez could use petroleum revenue to paper over the failures, importing everything Venezuela needed and distributing it through his political networks. The entire economy became a giant patronage machine designed to keep Chávez in power. Chávez also built a personality cult that would make North Korea jealous. His face was everywhere, on billboards, murals, government offices, even food packages. State television broadcast his speeches, which could last 6, 8, even 10 hours without interruption. Every Sunday, he hosted a show called Allo Presidente, where he would talk about anything and everything for hours on end while the nation watched. He sang songs, told jokes, made policy announcements, fired ministers live on air, and recited poetry. It was government as reality television, and it was brilliant propaganda because it made Chávez seem accessible and human while drowning out all other voices. Children in schools were required to sing songs praising Chávez. The national prayer was rewritten to replace "Who art in heaven" with references to Chávez. The indoctrination was total. Here's something most people don't know. Chávez was paranoid to the point of mental illness in his final years. He saw assassination plots everywhere. He had food tasters. He changed where he slept every night. He wore a bulletproof vest, even in secure locations. And he genuinely believed that the United States had somehow given him cancer. In 2011, when he was diagnosed with cancer, he publicly speculated that the CIA had developed technology to give Latin American leaders cancer, pointing to the fact that several leftist leaders in the region had been diagnosed around the same time. There was zero evidence for this, but it reveals the conspiratorial worldview that Chávez inhabited and passed on to his followers. As Chávez battled cancer between 2011 and 2013, he became obsessed with succession. He had always seen himself as indispensable, but now he had to choose an heir. He considered several candidates, but he ultimately settled on Nicolas Maduro, his foreign minister. Maduro was not the most obvious choice. He lacked military credentials, personal charisma, and political skill. But he had three crucial qualities: absolute loyalty to Chávez, close ties to Cuba's Castro regime, and a willingness to be a placeholder for Chávez's continued spiritual rule. In December 2012, knowing he was dying, Chávez appeared on television and explicitly told Venezuelans to vote for Maduro if he could not continue. It was an almost feudal transfer of power, a king choosing his successor based on personal loyalty rather than competence. Hugo Chávez died on March 5, 2013. The regime kept his death secret for hours, with rumors swirling that he had actually died days or even weeks earlier, and they were managing the announcement for political advantage. When Maduro finally appeared on television to announce Chávez's death, he wept openly and declared 7 days of national mourning. What happened next reveals just how deep the personality cult ran. Chávez's body was embalmed like Lenin or Mao and placed in a massive mausoleum in Caracas where people could come and view it. The building became a pilgrimage site, a secular cathedral to the Bolivarian Revolution. School children were brought in buses to file past the glass coffin. The message was clear: Chávez was dead, but Chavismo would live forever. Maduro immediately launched his presidential campaign using Chávez's ghost as his main asset. "I'm not Chávez," he would say, "but I am his son." He claimed to receive messages from Chávez in the form of a little bird that would visit him and whisper instructions. This sounds absurd to outsiders, but in a country where millions revered Chávez as a saint, it was effective propaganda. Maduro won the 2013 election by a razor-thin margin amid obvious fraud, and he immediately began invoking Chávez's name to justify every action. Any criticism of Maduro was reframed as an attack on Chávez's legacy. Any policy failure was blamed on forces trying to destroy what Chávez built. The dead man became more powerful than the living one. Over the next 13 years, as Maduro drove Venezuela into total collapse, he wrapped himself in Chávez's image like a shield. Every speech began with "as Comandante Chávez taught us." Every policy disaster was explained away as enemies attacking Chávez's vision. The mausoleum became the regime's most sacred site, more important than churches, more protected than government buildings. It wasn't just a tomb, it was the regime's claim to legitimacy. As long as Chávez's body lay there in state, as long as the monument stood, Maduro could argue that the revolution continued, that he was merely the steward of Chávez's eternal legacy. But here's what that legacy actually was. Chávez had destroyed Venezuela's democratic institutions so thoroughly that when Maduro took power, there were no checks on his incompetence and brutality. Chávez had normalized political persecution, making it acceptable to jail opponents and silence critics. Chávez had built a personality cult that transferred wholesale to his successor, allowing Maduro to demand the same uncritical loyalty. Chávez had forged alliances with Cuba, Russia, Iran, and China that gave Venezuela's dictatorship international protection. Chávez had militarized Venezuelan society and empowered armed gangs called colectivos to terrorize neighborhoods in the name of the revolution. And perhaps most crucially, Chávez had created a narrative that any suffering in Venezuela was caused by external enemies, America, oligarchs, saboteurs, rather than by the regime itself. That narrative allowed Maduro to starve millions while blaming U.S. sanctions, to imprison thousands while claiming to defend democracy, to preside over the largest refugee crisis in the hemisphere, while insisting Venezuela was under attack. When U.S. forces struck Venezuela on January 3, 2026, capturing Maduro and hitting dozens of regime targets, the decision to bomb Chávez's mausoleum was deliberate and symbolic. Militarily, the tomb had no strategic value. There were no weapons there, no command centers, no defensive positions. But symbolically, it was the heart of the regime. Destroying it sent multiple messages. To the regime, it said, "Your founding myth is dead. Your claim to revolutionary legitimacy is gone. The spirit you invoke for protection cannot save you." To the Venezuelan people, it said, "The ghost that has haunted your country for 25 years has finally been exorcised. The cult is broken. The nightmare can end." And to the world, it said, "Charismatic authoritarians may build personality cults that outlive them, but those cults can be destroyed, and history will not protect dictators who wrap themselves in revolutionary rhetoric while committing crimes against humanity." For millions of Venezuelans, watching footage of Chávez's mausoleum reduced to rubble sparked an extraordinary range of emotions. Many wept, not in grief, but in release, like victims of an abusive relationship finally seeing their abuser's power broken. In exile communities from Doral to Madrid, spontaneous celebrations erupted in the streets. People who had lost family members to regime violence, who had fled with nothing, who had watched from abroad as their country was destroyed, felt a weight lift. The mausoleum had been a constant reminder that Chavismo was eternal, that resistance was futile, that even death couldn't diminish Chávez's power. Its destruction suggested that perhaps the nightmare really could end, that perhaps Venezuela could finally begin to heal. Others felt conflicted. There were still millions of Venezuelans, particularly older people and rural poor, who remembered the early Chávez years as a time when they had dignity, when someone powerful had acknowledged their existence and tried to help them. For them, Chávez would always be flawed, but fundamentally good, a man who had genuinely cared about the poor, even if his methods were problematic. Seeing his grave bombed felt like desecration, like kicking a dead man, like America once again interfering in Latin America with bombs and arrogance. But for the vast majority of Venezuelans, especially younger generations who had lived through the Maduro years, the destruction of the mausoleum represented justice. They understood that you cannot build a new Venezuela while worshiping the man who destroyed the old one. They understood that as long as Chávez's body lay in state, as long as Maduro or some future strongman could invoke his name and claim his mantle, Venezuelan politics would remain trapped in a cycle of authoritarian populism and cult of personality. The bombing didn't just destroy a building and a corpse. It destroyed a claim to immortality. Hugo Chávez was no longer an eternal revolutionary spirit guiding Venezuela toward liberation. He was a dead dictator whose body was now scattered debris, whose legacy was repression and ruin, whose followers had brought Venezuela to its knees. History will debate Hugo Chávez for generations. Some will continue to argue that his early programs lifted millions out of poverty, that his anti-imperialist stance was justified, that his failures were mostly due to external sabotage and the incompetence of his successors rather than fundamental flaws in his vision. Others will argue that he was a textbook authoritarian who used democratic mechanisms to establish dictatorship, who squandered the greatest oil wealth in the Western Hemisphere, who normalized violence and repression, and who deliberately destroyed institutions that could have checked his power because he valued control above all else. Both views contain some truth, but what is undeniable is the outcome. 25 years after Chávez took power, Venezuela was a failed state. Millions of its citizens were in exile, tens of thousands had been killed or imprisoned for political reasons, and the economy had shrunk by 3/4. You don't create that level of catastrophe by accident. You create it through choices, through policies, through a deliberate decision to prioritize power over people and ideology over reality. The bombing of Hugo Chávez's mausoleum was not just about destroying a building or even about the capture of Nicolas Maduro. It was about breaking a spell. Venezuela had been under the influence of Chávez's charisma and revolutionary mystique for a quarter century, even after his death. That spell needed to be broken before Venezuela could move forward. Whether the country will actually move toward democracy and recovery, whether the capture of Maduro will lead to trials and accountability, whether Venezuela's fractured society can heal after so much trauma, all of that remains uncertain. But for the first time in decades, those possibilities exist. The ghost has been exorcised. The body has been destroyed. The monument has fallen. Whatever comes next, it will not be built on the foundation of Chávez's cult or the shield of his legend. And for millions of Venezuelans who have waited so long for this moment, that is reason enough to celebrate.